My name is Garrett, and this took place when I was a sophomore in college. When I didn't get a dorm after freshman year, I scrambled for off-campus housing. Long story short, I ended up in a co-op, part of a 3-house community that was sort of near campus, but not really. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap, and I didn't have many options. Plus, I had a bike, so I didn't really mind the extra travel time. Most of the residents were young students like me, but there were a few exceptions. There were a handful of alumni, 1 or 2 TAs, and a few older people getting their degrees later on in life. But the person who immediately stood out to me was an older woman who lived in one of the other houses. From what I could tell, she was maybe in her late 50s, even though she looked a little older than that. She had graying hair and walked with a sort of limp, like she had some kind of back injury. She was really quiet and mostly kept to herself, and she always had this blank expression on her face. I assumed she had some kind of connection to the university, maybe faculty, or maybe an alumni, but no one explained, and I didn't ask. The first time I saw her do something strange was in our common kitchen, which was a little weird to begin with because the 2 other houses had their own kitchen, so I wasn't sure why she'd be hanging out in ours. She wasn't cooking or eating or even talking to anyone. She was just standing there while the rest of us were talking and running around, making dinner and listening to music. She didn't try and join in, she just watched us blankly. I caught eyes with her a few times, and part of me got the feeling that she was watching me specifically, even though I knew that was unlikely. No one acknowledged her, which I thought was a little weird too. Maybe they knew something I didn't. Later that week, I was doing some homework in my room when I saw her again. I glanced out my bedroom window, and there she was, staring up at me. As if that wasn't strange enough by itself, she wasn't even on the sidewalk, but rather in the middle of the street. It was getting late, and it was decently cold too, so she must have been freezing out there. I couldn't tell if she was looking into my window or just in the general direction of the house, but I felt like she was staring at me specifically. I don't know why I did it, but I waved at her, trying to be friendly. The moment I did, I instantly regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she jumped up and down a few times like she was excited and then ran towards one of the other houses, presumably hers. I felt kind of sick. Not only had I acknowledged her, but I had confirmed that she had been looking into my room the entire time, and even if she hadn't, she now knew which room was mine. Later that night, I asked one of my housemates about her. He told me that that woman had always been there, and that I should try my best to ignore her like the rest of them did. I inquired further about her, but the guy genuinely didn't know anything, and said he was just repeating what someone had told him when he moved in. It didn't sit right with me, so I asked around until I got some semblance of an answer. One of the seniors in the specific house she lived in told me that she was associated with the university and was a little kooky, but that she didn't have a history of violence or getting physical. I asked him why no one found that as strange as I did, and he told me that they really couldn't control who lived there, as that decision was up to the property manager. I wasn't fully satisfied with that answer, but there was nothing I could do, so I tried to just block her out of my mind. But then it got worse. One night, I walked out of my room and nearly ran into her. She was in the hallway, standing right in front of my door. I literally jumped back because she caught me so off guard. It was past midnight on like a Tuesday, so the house was mostly dead. She didn't say anything when she saw me. She barely even reacted. Instead, she just turned and walked away as if I were the one who had intruded on her. I'm not going to go into every little detail, but there were several more occurrences like that one where I caught her either snooping somewhere where she had no business being, or doing something she had no business doing. At some point, I lost my room key. All 3 houses had once been part of the same hotel, so all the rooms had personal locks and keys. It was a co-op, so most people just left their doors unlocked, but I was someone who couldn't sleep comfortably knowing someone could just walk into my room, so losing my key was a big deal. Everyone had a spare, including me, but I was pissed because I'd have to go make a copy of the key, and that was an extra annoyance I couldn't afford at the time. A few nights later, I woke up randomly in the night. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it. There was a soft bumping coming from my closet every 20 seconds or so. It sounded like something shifting behind the door, like something was moving inside of my closet. I'm not one to scare easily, and I'm definitely not one to be helpless in a dangerous situation, so I was going to deal with this myself. I quietly got out of bed and took a deep breath. I slowly walked over to the closet, trying to keep my breathing under control. My heart was racing. In one fluid motion, I ripped the closet door open and screamed like a crazy person. Just as I expected, the woman was in there. She had one of my ties wrapped around her neck, and her eyes were wide open. She was holding a kitchen knife with her other hand. My scream must have startled her, because before I could react, she lunged at me with the knife outstretched. I screamed again, only this one wasn't pretend. It was a scream of pure fear. I wrestled her to the ground and was able to disarm her pretty easily, given how frail and small she was. That didn't make the situation any less terrifying, though. She kicked and fought and bit as I pinned her to the ground, screaming the whole time. I yelled for help, and I heard some doors slam, followed by some of my housemates running down the hall. My friend Lee immediately helped me immobilize the woman, and the two of us kept her pinned while someone else called the police. The rest of the night was a blur. The police got there quickly and arrested her on the spot. By that point, she had stopped screaming, but she refused to say anything either, which was extremely unsettling. The cops found my room key on her. Real big shocker there. A few weeks later, we got our answer about who she was. Apparently, she was the property manager's sister, who he had been letting live there under the radar. She had severe mental health issues, and instead of getting her proper care, he had just thrown her into one of the unoccupied rooms. I believe the property manager was eventually arrested for negligence and a slew of other things, and rightfully so. I honestly blame him so much more for what happened than her. If anything, I feel bad for her, but my pity won't erase the fact that she tried to kill me. I could have lost my life that night. I have no idea why she seemed so interested in me specifically, but I can only hope nothing like that ever happens to me again. I'm graduating soon, and I'm definitely going to miss college, but I don't think I'll ever be able to look back on my time here without thinking about that night. This isn't really my story, but I essentially watched the whole thing happen, so I'm telling it anyway. I've lived in a modest 2-story home with my husband Benjamin for the better part of 20 years now. All of our kids are out living their own lives, and I couldn't be prouder. What I'm about to tell you happened last year. Someone had just moved into the house across the street, which was really nice because I was getting sick of looking out at a vacant house all the time. I'm retired, so I spend a lot of time on my front porch, knitting, reading, enjoying the weather with my husband, you name it. I also listen to a lot of true crime podcasts out there, and sometimes I'll just play music. The person who moved into the house across the street was a young guy, maybe mid-20s. He drove an expensive-looking BMW and always dressed in flashy clothing, so I figured he was either well off or seriously pretending. I hope I'm not giving the wrong impression about him. He was actually really sweet. He introduced himself to us after a few days. His name was Quinn, and he was a few years out of college, like I had guessed. He was a really bright guy and got along really well with Benjamin. They laughed and talked about sports, and Benjamin even dropped a few of his own college stories that I hadn't heard in a long time. Quinn said he worked in the entertainment industry, and that he did freelance work for some internet personality person, whatever that means. It kind of went over my head, but it must have been lucrative. He looked pretty wealthy, like I said. He talked about stocks with Benjamin, and told us about some of the investments he was making. All in all, he seems like a nice guy. Things were normal for a few months. Like I said, I spent a lot of time on my porch, so Quinn would often wave to me when leaving his house, and I always waved back. I can't remember exactly when, but I started noticing the same girl going over to Quinn's house every so often. She drove a little white convertible, and she was pretty, young, blonde, the type of girl you'd expect a guy like him to date. To be frank, she dressed a bit scandalously, which I didn't fully appreciate. I figured she was his girlfriend, maybe checking on the house while he was out. She had her own house key, so it made sense. It became a regular thing. Once, maybe twice a week, I'd see that car roll up while Quinn was gone. She'd go inside, stay for a while, then leave. I didn't really understand what she was doing, but young people date differently these days, so I kept my thoughts to myself. Then, one evening, I saw them together. Quinn pulled into his driveway with her in the passenger seat. That confirmed it, she was his girlfriend, just as I had assumed. But shortly after that day, things started getting tense. At least, that's what it seemed like. One afternoon, I was out tending to my little garden when I heard shouting from across the street. Quinn and the girl were standing in the driveway, yelling at each other. I couldn't catch what they were arguing about, but I didn't need to. She kept throwing her hands in the air, practically spitting her words at him. It looked like she was going to strike him. Eventually, she got in the car, slammed the door, and tore off down the road. Quinn shook his head and went back inside. I don't even think he noticed me. I figured it was a lover's spat. Every couple fights, and it wasn't my place to butt in where I was unwelcome. But then I saw that girl's car in front of his house again when he wasn't home. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. I told Benjamin, and he said it was rude to pry and that I should just leave the poor boy alone, which I agreed with. But then came the night everything went sideways. Benjamin and I were asleep when we woke up to sirens blaring outside. We rushed outside, joining the handful of neighbors who had come out to see what was going on. Quinn's house was swarming, police cars, an ambulance, the whole nine. We watched as the cops emerged from his house with that girl in handcuffs. She didn't struggle or scream, just accepted what was going on and stared ahead with a blank expression. We saw Quinn being rushed outside on a stretcher. He was a bloody mess, and I gasped at the sight. We didn't see him for a week after that. I was worried sick. When he finally came back, Benjamin and I walked over to check on him. He let us in without hesitation and told us everything. Apparently, that girl, her name was Ellie, had confessed to everything, making things easy for the police. For starters, she wasn't supposed to have his house key. She had stolen his spare and made a copy without him knowing. According to him, she started asking him for things. Fancy dinners, jewelry, expensive trips. When he hesitated, she got possessive and angry, which was when things started going downhill in their relationship. Every time she had shown up unannounced to his house, he hadn't been aware. She had access to his location through his phone, which I didn't even know was possible. She had gone through all of his stuff, but worst of all, she had planted hidden cameras in his room. Every time she went back to his house when he wasn't there, she was replacing the camera batteries and making sure they were still working. The argument between them that I overheard was Quinn's attempt at breaking up with her. She refused, and Quinn reluctantly agreed to go on a break. Ellie had seen everything through the cameras, and the next night, she went to his house with a knife. I'm not going to explain the rest, you get the idea. Somehow, Quinn managed to get her to the grounds, but not before she seriously injured him. The doctors said he was an inch away from needing surgery, or dying. Benjamin and I tried to console him, but he was visibly shaken. The last thing he said before we left was that he had learned his lesson about flaunting his money, especially around pretty girls. He moved out not long after. He said he didn't feel safe in that house anymore, and that his ex had tons of friends just like her, and he didn't feel comfortable with the thought that they might have known where he lived. We never saw him again. I pray to God he's doing okay. No one should ever have to go through something like that, especially not someone as young as him. When I moved into my new place, I was just looking for a fresh start. I won't get into the details, but let's just say I had a bad situation with an ex that made staying in my old city impossible. I ran into some money early in life and made some bad decisions about the kind of women I surrounded myself with. Lesson learned. The neighborhood I moved to is really nice. Low crime, quiet, mostly families. The houses here are really spaced out, which was partially what drew me there. But for some reason, the property next to mine is much closer in proximity than most of the other properties are to each other. And by the way, that house next door is huge. When I first saw it, I thought I could easily fit a family of 10. That's honestly what I assumed at first, that a big family lived there, grandparents and everything. But I could not have been more wrong. Even though I try to be low-key, I wasn't going to be a rude neighbor. I took it upon myself to introduce myself to everyone in the neighborhood. For whatever reason, I decided to introduce myself to my next-door neighbors last. I couldn't tell you why. Everyone else I met seemed really sweet and genuine. I'd say 90% of them were parents of young children. And yes, they were all slightly intimidating, purely based on how successful they seemed to be. I wasn't too sure how a younger guy like myself would easily blend into a community like that, but that was more of a personal concern. When I got around to meeting my next-door neighbor, my social battery was mostly drained from having spent the day making small talk with strangers. I knew if I just went back home, I was never going to be as motivated to meet them, so I just sucked it up and walked up their driveway. I had gotten accustomed to being greeted by someone middle-aged, so when a young-looking dude in a mullet opened the door, I was a little taken aback. Hell, he looked even younger than me, which was definitely a shock. I recovered quickly, and went ahead with my new-to-the-neighborhood spiel. As I went on, he flashed me this massive smile and actually cut me off before I could even finish talking. He said something along the lines of, "Oh wow, someone who was born in my decade, what a nice surprise." I laughed and told him the same thing, venting to him about how out of place I felt as a single guy in his late 20s amongst so many families with kids. He told me not to worry about that, and that most of the people who lived here kept to themselves, which was kind of a relief for me. He introduced himself as Damon, and told me I should come by for a drink sometime. I shrugged my shoulders and said, hell, why not right now? To which I expected him to laugh and invite me in. Instead, though, he looked over his shoulder like he was scanning his living room, and then he turned back to me, saying he wished he could, but he was busy working. I asked him what he did for work, because it just seemed like a normal follow-up question to what he said, and he dropped his smile a bit. After a weird stare, he laughed and just said, finance. but didn't elaborate any more than that, which I thought was a bit strange. I told him fair enough and asked if he had any roommates. To my surprise, he told me he lived there alone, which was absolutely insane to me given how big the house was. We chit-chatted for a few more minutes, and he gave me his number before going back inside. I was excited that someone my age lived here, especially because he seemed like a really chill guy, but I couldn't get over how odd it was for someone like that to live all alone. And yeah, I know I was essentially doing the same thing, but you have to keep in mind my house wasn't even half the size of his. Anyway, I went back home and got on with my life. That was about 6 months ago. For a few weeks after that, nothing eventful really happened. I texted Damon a few days after he gave me his number to try and set something up, but he'd always complain about how busy he was and how sorry he was that we couldn't hang out. Eventually, I gave up with him. Not in a hostile way, just in a you-do-you kind of way. I'm definitely not the type of person to bend over backwards for someone who seems disinterested. I never saw anyone coming or going from Damon's place. No visitors, no parties, no girls, nothing. He never even got takeout delivered, which was strange to me because his car was always in the driveway. I genuinely didn't know what he ate because I literally never saw him leave the house. The guy lived like a ghost. I work from home, and the office in my house is on the 3rd floor, which overlooks Damon's property, if you're wondering how I knew so much about his living habits. I know it sounds obsessive and a little creepy, but his house was also just a glance away from my monitor, so I couldn't help but look over from time to time. One night, it was a Wednesday night, I remember that distinctly, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of loud music. I sleep with my windows open, so that's probably how I woke up so easily. At first, I thought I was imagining it, or it was part of a really vivid dream I was having, but I was wrong. I got out of bed and peeked out my window, and there they were, 7 or so cars lined up in Damon's driveway. There was no mistaking it, he was having a party. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the type to complain about some noise. I've been to my fair share of house parties, but it was the middle of the week, and the volume was insane. I figured I'd just go over, knock, and ask him to turn it down. I threw on a hoodie and walked over. It was a full-blown party, that much was clear from outside. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I pulled out my phone to text Damon, but I decided against it, knowing he'd probably ignore me and give me some BS excuse the following morning. I knocked on the door again, harder this time. Still nothing. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, the door swung open. Inside, the first thing I saw was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs, but there was something off. There was literally no one in there. I moved further in, expecting to see people in the living room, maybe the kitchen, but it was completely empty. There weren't even any drinks left out. I could hear people over the music that was playing in the background though, which I didn't understand. But then, I really listened to it, and everything hit me all at once. It wasn't even music, really. It was a recording, a literal recording of people laughing, yelling, clinking glasses. The whole party was fake, all of it. But that didn't make sense to me. It still didn't explain the shoes or the cars. There were people in that house, that much was certain. I should have turned around right then, but I needed to know what was going on. I moved discreetly around the house until I saw a door that was slightly ajar. I gently pushed it open, and it led down to the basement. I'm not sure how I knew, but something told me what I was looking for was downstairs. It was dark down those stairs, with the exception of a very faint light coming from somewhere I couldn't see. There was no reason to go down there, I knew that, but I did it anyway. I got to the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The light was coming from another door somewhere deeper in the basement. I crept towards it, and as I got closer, I started to pick up on another noise I hadn't been able to hear earlier over the music. It sounded almost mechanical. It was this heavy, rhythmic grinding, like heavy machinery or a buzzsaw or something. I got a little closer, close enough to see through the crack. There were 3 people standing in there, looking across the room at something that was out of view. They were all older-looking guys, significantly older than Damon. They were wearing heavy-duty work clothes and had on these protective goggles and thick rubber gloves. I also realized they were wearing what looked like work boots, even though I had seen all those other shoes upstairs. Under different circumstances, I would have assumed that they were construction workers. I really wanted to see what they were looking at, but it was too far out of view. After a few seconds of me just standing there, I started to pick up on this awful bleach smell, or some kind of cleaning solution. That's what did it for me. I started to feel this awful pit in my stomach, like my life was in danger. I can't explain it. I turned to leave, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I was finding my way back to the stairs, the light from behind me suddenly dimmed, like someone had shut the door behind me. I didn't actually hear the door over the music, but I felt it. I sprinted up the stairs as fast as I could. I ran through the house and burst out the front door. I didn't run directly to my house. I jumped my own fence and made it to the backyard. I slipped in through my side door, locking it behind me. My chest was pounding, but under no circumstances could I let Damon or any of those other guys know it was me who had been snooping around. I gathered myself and went up to my office, making sure all the lights up there were off. I crouched down below the window and peeked over at Damon's house. There was no one there. But then, a few minutes later, the front door flew open and like 8 guys poured out, scanning the yard, the driveway, the street, but Damon wasn't with them. I could tell because everyone looked older, like those first guys I had seen. A few of them looked like they were arguing about something, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. One of the men actually shoved one of the other ones, and I thought they were about to start fighting in the street, but they didn't. Eventually, they all went back inside, and the music stopped soon after that. I stood at the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even say? The music wasn't playing anymore, and there was no real crime I could actually report. The thing I couldn't understand was how none of my other neighbors had a problem with the loud music, especially since most of them had children. I figured if they hadn't been able to hear it and I called the police, Damon would know it was me. And the shoes, I had no idea what that was about either. The people I had seen were all wearing boots. So did they bring extra pairs of shoes just to leave in the foyer? I had too many questions and I didn't know what to do, so I just went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and looked out my bedroom window. Every single car was gone, including Damon's. I went upstairs to try and get some work done, but I couldn't concentrate and found myself looking over at Damon's house every 5 seconds. After a few hours of his car not being there, I decided to go for a walk, partly to clear my head, but mostly to take some low-key glances through his windows. Nothing, though. Days passed and Damon still didn't return, or his car didn't at least. I was baffled with every passing day. I still couldn't figure out how my other neighbors had been able to sleep through all the noises that night, so I just straight up asked them. I went to a few houses and asked them if they had heard the party he had a few nights ago. No one knew what I was talking about, even after I told them which house it was coming from and how late it was. I thought I was going crazy. That was a few months ago now. The crazy thing is Damon still hasn't returned, and it's clear no one is maintaining his house, as the grass is starting to get really long, and there's an untouched pile of packages leaning against his front door. I don't know what to make of this. It could be nothing, but I feel like no one would go to such lengths to disguise what they were doing with a fake party, unless it was something illegal. But would people going to such lengths really forget something as important as locking the front door? Maybe that's what those guys had been arguing about. I really have no idea, and the fact that none of my other neighbors seemed bothered by it makes me think I'm involved in some huge conspiracy or something. I know I'm just being paranoid, but I just have so many unanswered questions. When Damon returns, if he ever does, I'm debating whether or not I should just go and straight up ask him,